in him, since in essence, since Satan looks to sift us all like wheat, since in essence, since but he prays, since that our faith, since in essence will not fail, since in essence, since we need that faith, since in essence, since strengthen your brothers, since in essence, since and when you have turned back, since strengthen your brothers, since in essence, since even Simon, since Master, since I am ready to go with you, since even to prison, since and to death, since but Yeshua says, since I tell you, since Peter, since a rooster will not crow today, since until you have denied 3 times that you know me, since in essence, since the Lord knows, since our frailty, since our flesh, since in essence, since he's being real, since about the flesh, since about the person, since in essence, since letting us know, since the spirit, since it's willing, since but the flesh, since it's weak, since in essence, since Matthew, since Matthew, since verse 41, chapter 26, since keep watching, since and praying, since so that you won't enter into temptation, since the spirit is willing, since but the flesh is weak, since Yeshua, since knows that, since in essence, since of us, since in essence, since also, since letting us know, since there will be a time, since it's not going to be peaceful, since in essence, since it's not going to be, since it's not going to be favorable, since in essence, since, and he said to them, since when I sent you out without a money pouch, since and travel bag, since and sandals, since you didn't lack anything, since did you? Since they said, since no, since nothing. Since then he said to them, since but now, since whoever has a money pouch must carry it as well as a travel bag. Since and whoever does not own a sword must sell his cloak, since and buy one, since in essence, since for I tell you that this which is written must be fulfilled in me, since and he was counted with the lawless, since in essence, since there would be a time, since in essence, since lawlessness, since in essence, since a time, since not peaceful, since not favorable, since in essence, since for what it is written about me is being fulfilled, since but they said, since Master, since look here, since 2 swords, since he said to them, since it is enough, since in essence, since there is a time, since we can still find favor in him, since in essence, but since there's a time, since that's not peaceful, since that's evil, since that's lawless, since in essence, since stressful, worryful, since not the time, since like when he said to them, since when I sent you out, since without a money pouch, since in travel bag, since in sandals, since you didn't lack anything, did you? Since did you? Since they said, since no, since nothing, since they were not even worrisome, since it was peaceful, since favorable, since but there's a time. Since there is a time, since that's evil, since that's chaotic, unpeaceful, since in essence, since unfavorable, since in essence, since verse 39, since Yeshua since and Yeshua, yeah, we're still in chapter 22, verse 39, going further. Since and Yeshua came out, since and went as usual to the Mount of Olives. Since and the disciples followed him. Since when he reached the place, since he said to them, since pray that you will not enter into temptation. Since and he pulled back about a stone's throw from them. Since got on his knees, since and began to pray, since saying, since Father, since if you are willing, since take this cup from me, since yet not my will, since but yours be done. Since now an angel from heaven appeared to him, since and strengthened him. Since and in his anguish, since he was praying fervently. Since and his sweat was like drops of blood falling down on the ground. Since when he rose up from prayer, since he came to the disciples, since and found them asleep, since exhausted from grief. Since and he said to them, since why are you sleeping? Since get up, since and pray, since so that you won't enter into temptation. Since while Yeshua was speaking, since suddenly a crowd came, since and the one called Judah, since one of the 12, since approached Yeshua to kiss him, since but Yeshua said to him, since Judah, since with a kiss you betray the Son of Man, since when those around him saw what was going to happen, since they said to him, since Master, since shall we strike with the sword? Since and one of them struck the servant of the Kohen Gadol, since and cut off his right ear. Since but Yeshua answered, since and said, since stop this now. Since and he touched the man's ear, since and healed him. Since then Yeshua said to the ruling kohanim, since and officers of the temple guard, since and the elders who had come against him, since have you come out with swords, since and clubs as you would against a revolutionary? Since every day I was with you in the temple, since yet you did not lay a finger on me. Since but this is yours, since the hour, since and the powers of darkness. Since then they seized Yeshua, since and led him away, since and brought him into the house of the Kohen Gadol, since but Peter was falling from a distance. Since in essence, since now they had lit a fire in the center of the courtyard, since and sat down together, since and Peter was sitting among them, since then a servant girl saw him sitting at the fire. Since she looked straight at him, since and said, since this one was with him too? Since but he denied it, since saying, since woman, since I don't know him. Since a little later, since another saw him, since and said, since you too are one of them. Since but Peter said, since man, since I am not. Since about an hour later, since another began to insist, since saying, since certainly, since this fellow was with him, since for he too is a Galilean. Since by Peter said, since man, since I don't know what you're talking about. Since and immediately, since while he was still speaking, since a rooster crowed. Since and the Lord turned, since and looked straight at Peter. Since then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, since how he had told him, since before the rooster crows today, since you will deny me 3 times. Since and Peter went out, since and wept bitterly. Since now the men who were guarding Yeshua began mocking, since and beating him, since they blindfolded him, since and kept asking him, since saying, since prophesy, since who is the one who hit you, since and reviling him, since they were saying many other things against him. Since as it become day, since the elders of the people gathered together, since both ruling kohanim, since and Torah scholars, since and they led him away to their council, since saying, since if you are Mashiach, tell us. Since but Yeshua said to them, since if I tell you, since you will never believe, since and if I ask you, since you will never answer, since but from now on, since the Son of Man is seated at the right hand of the power of God, since they all said, since are you then Ben-Elohim? Since and to them he said, since you say that I am. Since and they said, since what further need do we have for testimony? Since well we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. Since in essence, since Yeshua, since felt the pressure on him, since in essence, since he felt, since he was God, since but man as man, since he was walking, since as man, since in essence, since he felt, since the pressure on him, since pray that you will not enter into temptation, since and he pulled back about a stone's throw from them, since got on his knees, since and began to pray, since saying, since Father, since if you are willing, since take this cup from me, since yet not my will, since but yours be done. Since he was obedient, since to the Father, since unto the end, since doing the Father's will, since in essence, since in the midst of persecution, since in the midst of trials, since in the midst of the pressure, since the weight, since that was put on him, since in essence, laid on him, since in essence, since he felt it, since he's God, but since he was man, since in essence, since God, since at that time, since at that moment, since as man, since in essence, since he felt it, since in essence, since in essence, since now an angel from heaven appeared to him, since and strengthened him, since and in his anguish, since he was praying fervently, since and his sweat was like drops of blood falling down on the ground, since in essence, since when he rose up from prayer, since he came to the disciples, since and found them asleep, since exhausted from grief, since and he said to them, since why are you sleeping? Since get up, since and pray, since so that you won't enter into temptation, since in essence, since the spirit is willing, since but the flesh is weak, since in essence, since we must do similarly, since we need to pray, since in essence, since so that you won't enter into temptation, since in essence, since Judah, since came, since with a kiss, since betrayed, since the Son of Man, since in essence, since in essence, since since they wanted to strike, since one of them struck the servant of the Kohen Gadol, since and cut off his right ear, since but Yeshua answered since and said, since stop this now, since he touched the man's ear, since and healed him. Since Yeshua knew, since he had to go forward, since with the Father's will, since in essence, since